Hi, welcome to my channel. In this video we'll have a look at the feedback module's MixBX mixer. This 6-channel eurorack mixer is heavily based on a mixer that was popular in the 90s techno scene, mainly for its ability to add a lot of gain and saturation to the popular drum machines of that era. If you're curious about the original, which shares the same strengths and shortcomings of this eurorack version, I found a really interesting and honest review video by a Scottish content creator about this mixer, where he talks a little bit about his experience with it and he shows you how it sounds. In this video I'll give you a brief overview of the features of the feedback module's MixBX. I'll show you a few tricks how you can use it for different things than just mixing. And after that I'll do a really systematic playthrough of this mixer with several sounds, showing you how the equalizers work, how different gain settings sound, and how mixing together the channels sounds like. Because if there's one thing you need to know about this mixer, then it's really just how it sounds. And the thing it's really good for is adding saturation. And this saturation really glues everything together and it almost acts like a compressor. So let's have a brief overview of the features of the MixBX. Now, first of all, please don't get confused. This module over here is a 4 HP wide compressor unit by feedback modules as well. It's called Squeeze, and I will do a separate video about this. Let's mute channel 2 for a moment. So first of all, there's the mute switches. It's really satisfying to flick these switches. They feel really sturdy, and by the way, the build quality of the feedback modules is just excellent. Everything feels really heavy duty and there's no wobbly stuff going on. I really like that. So let's follow the signal chain. So at the top here, there's the inputs. There's 6 of them, as you can see. Next to the inputs are little knobs. These set the input gain. And these really add a lot of volume to your signal. Then there's a really basic but useful equalizer with a knob for the low and the high frequencies. Turning the low knob to the left, as you might expect, attenuates the low frequencies, and turning it to the right of the center position boosts the low frequencies. And the same logic, of course, applies to the knob for the high frequencies. Then below that there are 2 aux send knobs. You can use these to add, for example, effects to a channel. The aux 1 knobs correspond to the aux 1 output over here. Turning the aux knob to the right, for example the aux 1, sets the volume that channel 1 in this case will be present at the output labeled aux 1. You can use this to send into an effect unit like the Pico DSP here, and I'm just going to use the stereo outputs of this effect to send back into the mixer, and for this you use the return inputs, and these are stereo, and you have 2 pairs, 1 pair for aux 1, 1 pair for aux 2. Now of course you can send in any signal you want here. You really don't have to use these for returning the effects, but that is what their intended use is. You have a volume control for this return, which attenuates the signal coming from, in this case, my effect. You can see here there's a knob for master volume, which of course sets the master volume. Below that there's a stereo mini jack output for plugging in a headphone. There's a separate level control for this. And even when you turn the master knob completely down, it's possible to get a signal from the headphone output by just using its own level control. Then below the two send knobs labeled aux1 and aux2, there's a pan control, which of course just pans your signal between the two outputs, which are at the top here and labeled out left and out right. Then there's a separate volume control. This is like a fader on most mixers. Here it's a knob. At least in the eurorack format I really prefer knobs because I personally find it easier to adjust them. So now let's unmute channel 2. Let's pan channel 1 to the left, channel 2 to the right. Let's add some reverb to channel 2 as well. So everything blends nicely together. We can quickly add some gain to both channels, which adds some grit to the signal. I don't want to overdo this for these kind of sounds, but of course you can go haywire with them. And by the way, there's really little headroom in this kind of mixer, which means that even when the signal coming in is rather low, and even when you set the gain at its minimum position, turning up the volume can increase some saturation. And this is really independent of the level of the master output, because as you can see, this is really low at the moment. For these kind of sounds, I prefer it a little cleaner. Perhaps we can saturate the drums a little bit, add some low end. By the way, the aux synths are post fader and post equalizer, which means that even when you turn the aux synths completely up, turning down the volume fader or knob in this case, attenuates the signal going to the aux as well. Same logic applies to the equalizer. Whenever you cut or boost frequencies, these are also cut or boosted in the aux synths that you use. Now, a quick tip. This is not related to this mixer. I really like to do this with most mixers. I really like to use separate channels for my effect returns. So instead of using the built-in stereo returns, I usually go for two channels, panned left and right, and this gives me much more control over how the effects are sounding, because for example now I can saturate them separately from the sources. I can cut out some lows so it doesn't get too muddy. One thing that's worth mentioning is that the stereo returns are not normal to each other, which means if you use a mono effect and just plug it in one side of the returns, the signal is most surely only present at the side that you plug it in. In some mixers, these returns are normaled, which means that when you send in just one cable, you can hear the effect on both sides, but that's not the case here. And this is another example where using a separate mixer channel perhaps is more preferable, because when you just center the pan knob, you will hear the effect in both ears. It won't be stereo, but at least it will be present at the left and the right main outputs. But why would I do this in mono if I can do this in stereo? When using mono channels to route stereo signals to, please be sure to turn the pan knobs completely to the left and to the right, because if you center them or leave them in some kind of lopsided way, your stereo image is going to be completely destroyed. You can do this with intent, but just remember, when you're doing this and something sounds weird or wrong, check your pan knobs. And this way you can even route the effect back to itself, which is kind of interesting when you start using delays. And this is how people used to do it for getting feedback in a delay effect. By the way, these knobs are really stiff. There's a lot of torque. Equalizer knobs feel the same as the aux synths, but the panning knobs are really stiff. They're a little bit hard to turn, but actually I prefer it this way because it's easier to get them completely centered if you want to, and you won't accidentally nudge them when you don't want to. Now, one of the interesting things that people used to do to create really distorted sounding kick drums, to be honest, I never ventured into this hardstyle saturated kind of kick drum, but I know one of the techniques used to create these overdriven hard bass drums was to channel different channels of a mixer together. Now, normally you would need a mixer with direct outs for this, which the Mix BX doesn't have. But by using the aux synths on this mixer, you can create the same kind of signal chain. So right now we're only listening to channel 2, which receives a kick drum coming from the WMD crater. This is the sound with the gain at 0, but as soon as we start turning up the gain, you'll start hearing a really noticeable saturation. Now, of course, by using the equalizer, you can boost the low and the high frequencies to shape the sound. What you can do is use the aux synths to route this saturated tone to another channel. For this I need to turn up the aux 1, because I'm going to use the aux 1 output here. So by turning up the aux here, you make sure that the kick drum is coming from this output. Normally you would send this to an effect and use the effect returns. I really just want to route it back to another channel. But now, of course, we're listening to both channel 2 and 3. And as soon as I mute the original channel with the original kick drum, since the aux synths on this mixer are post fader, muting this channel mutes everything down the chain as well, of course. But as you can hear, by doing this, you can further shape the tone of your kick drum. But if we want to listen to this channel only, we really need to use another aux synth and plug this into your interface. What I'm going to do is just route it to another mixer here that's going to separate inputs on my interface. And then what you do on this channel 3 that's receiving the first aux, is turn up the synth for the second aux. Don't turn up the aux for the first, because this just creates a feedback loop where we're sending channel 3 to the aux 1, and the aux 1 output is going back into channel 3, so this creates feedback. Of course, this can be really interesting and cool to do as well. But that's not what I wanted to show you. Let's now turn up the aux synth 2, which is this output, this cable going into another mixer. And what this output now gives you is the chain of these two channels. The kick drum is coming in channel 2, I'm sending it out of the aux synth 1, this is going into channel 3. I'm using the aux synth 2 on this third channel to route into another mixer or your interface. And instead of listening to these two kick drums in parallel like we were doing a few minutes ago, now we're really listening to them in series. And by just playing around with the gain settings on these two channels and the equalizers, there's even more variation that you can achieve for this one simple kick drum sound. And of course you can add that feedback loop again. Just be careful when you do this, because it might be possible that you create a really high-pitched feedback loop that could really damage your hearing. But that's with every kind of feedback patch, especially when you're wearing headphones. I want to show you one more thing that I thought of doing with this mixer. Let me first build up this patch. On channel 1 we're hearing a wavetable coming from Chaos Devices Jena. It's analyzing a saw wave coming from Generate 3 that's being sequenced by Moskwa. The kick drum on channel 2 is coming from the WMD Creator. Both the synth and the kick drum are centered. Then I have two channels of hi-hats and percussion coming from two Pico drums. Now while this sounds okay, I think using this trick it sounds even better. What I'm doing here is actually use parallel compression, or it's really just saturation, but saturation kind of compresses the sound as well. Let me just demonstrate this with the kick drum. It's similar to what I did before. I'm using both the aux synths to send the kick drum to both the aux outputs, and I'm sending them back into the mixer on two channels spanned left and right. And essentially this is my parallel bus compression or saturation. I'm doing the same thing with the synth, but just a little bit less. So there's less of the synth going into this parallel saturation here. And then for the percussion and the hi-hats, as you might have noticed, they are panned left and right. And I want to keep this stereo separation in this parallel saturation bus. And since I've routed the aux1 output to a channel that I have panned to the left, the aux2 output to a channel that I have panned right, I only want to send the percussion and the hi-hats that are panned left to my first aux, because if I would send this channel, which is panned to the left, to the second aux as well, this would end up at the right of my stereo image as well, and that's not what I want. And by doing it the other way around for the percussion and hi-hat channel that's panned to the right, so I'm only sending it to the aux2 output, I keep the stereo separation like it was. And by tweaking the gain and the equalizers on this parallel saturation bus I've created here, I can control the amount of saturation or pseudo compression, and I can keep my lows more clean by cutting out the low end on this saturation bus. Or I can go a different route and keep my highs rather clean. It's never going to be completely clean when there's so much going on this mixer. And I can really set the amount that I want this saturation bus in the main output. I mean, I can turn it up completely, or at least a lot more, but that's too much. But just by adding it a little bit, it gives some weight to this patch, and it especially glues the drums a little bit together. So this is the last time you will hear me talking in this video. There's another segment coming up where I've made a patch, something similar to this, and I go through every sound on every channel. I play around with the equalizers with different gain settings to show you what the effect is of these parameters on different types of sounds. And then after I've gone through all the channels, I mix them together and I try different ways to balance the sounds so you won't hear me again. I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. It's more a systematic approach. It's probably not for everyone, but if you really want to know how this mixer sounds, it's definitely worth to keep watching till the end. I hope you learned something from this video. If there's any questions, please leave them in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time. Bye.